All right, good evening. So tonight I am presenting to you my keynote lecture that I gave at NORWAC this past Memorial Day weekend. It is the result of a couple years of research, many years of experience in the field, and then also a culmination of some random bits of learning that I've had scattered around just due to my own personal interests and curiosities. So tonight the talk is Mysticism, Reason, and Dogmatics. I want to start, this is, I think, a great way to start. I don't know about how life was for you guys when COVID hit. Things got very interesting for me. I had just moved back from London to New York. I moved to a new neighborhood. I didn't really know anybody, but also, you know, we were in lockdown. New York really got hit pretty hard. It was around this time, a couple months after things got really tough, that I was looking for new ways to kind of stretch my social interaction. I was really lucky to, at that stage, already be friends with some very brilliant minds. And I joined book clubs with 4 of them. And part of the discussion that we'll have today is going to be a culmination of discussions that I've had with each of these people, either collectively or individually, as a result of some of these books that we were reading. So I just want to give them the shout out. I like that Michael J. Morris, feminist astrologer, says that citing your sources is an act of feminism. And, you know, the more I think about that, I think it's a really powerful concept. So it's also nice to be able to give this shout out for that reason. So to the left, we've got these 2 gentlemen. We joined a cross-discipline study on the topic of physics, mathematics, and mysticism. It was a very cool group. Mason Travail, he's a private researcher specializing in local and folk histories and histories of the Black diaspora. He's a common friend between me and Marvin. And Marvin and Mason were about to do a book club and read a book about, it was a collection of essays, Quantum Questions. You can get it by Ken Wilber. It's a collection of essays of mystical writings from the founders of modern physics. And it was a really powerful read. These 2 were about to get started. I had mentioned to Mason that I wanted to get myself involved in a book club, and he goes, well, I'm about to join one with an astrophysicist. Would you like to join? So now we've got a historian and an astrophysicist and an astrologer all in a book club together. And it was one of the most exciting moments of my quarantine experience. So I just want to shout these individuals out. Marvin Jones Jr. is here tonight. He's a PhD candidate at Indiana University in the field of computational astrophysics. So you can tell from that, he's a very clever guy. On the right, these 2 women have been, you know, spiritual partners of mine, I think, for many years. I've not really spoken about it publicly in quite some time. When I went to school at the University of Washington, I declared as a member of the Baha'i faith. It's something that still guides me, and it's very close to my life. I just don't talk about it very much with people. These 2 women I met early in my journey, and I think that they're really fantastic minds and people to know. Kirby Twila Gray is a doctoral candidate in herbal medicine and acupuncture. She's an indigenous healer and storyteller and channeler and ancestral channeler. And Saman Maidani is an award-winning director, editor, and producer of documentary and narrative films. So together with these 2 women, we held it was not quite a book club, more of an essay club. We were reading essays and small excerpts of text. We did read one book in full, but the subject was far and wide. I mean, we were talking about things related to culture, religion, mysticism. It was a very interesting combination. So I just want to point these people out to, you know, express my gratitude for the deep conversations we've had over the years. And hopefully I've presented some of these ideas in a way that is exciting for you guys as well. All right, so let's get started. This topic tonight is focused on a couple things, but it's centered around this idea about the human experience. I just want to start by saying that. I was noticing when I was lining up my superior planet transits and activities over the next 10, 20, 30 years. A very consistent theme kept showing up, and it was an emphasis on the air signs. Now, the air signs are called the human signs. They are 3 of the 12 signs of the zodiac. The first is Libra, represented as the scales. Now, the scales probably don't look to you to be human. I mean, these are called human signs because the image is human. So you've got Aquarius, which is the water bearer, and Gemini, twins, the 2 twins. You know, every other sign, it's an animal. So you got Aries as the ram, or Scorpio the scorpion, or Taurus the bull, and, you know, Cancer the crab. So when you look around, it's, you know, it's the zodiac, it's the circle of animals is what that word zodiac means. But there are 3 signs which are held in human image. First is Libra, like I said, and it's the cardinal one. It's the central pivot of all of the fixed signs. Libra is represented as the scales. Now, it looks like just a piece of machinery, and, you know, it's hard to see a human image in that, I suppose. It's the image of metal, which is probably relevant, I think, in a great deal to the way that Libra actually plays out, if you really, you know, think about it. I'll leave that comment aside for now. The point is that Libra, it's always represented by a type of scale that must be held by a human hand. It's not enough that the scales exist. They must be picked up by an assessor. So there's a human component where justice is held in the hands of a human that can just, you know, I just am seeing my camera, how close my fist is. But yeah, so, I mean, if you're holding on to the scales, you have some input into the way these things are balanced and the way that these things move. And Libra being a cardinal sign about change, movement, facilitation of justice, all kind of those themes kind of come through. So we've got a lot of transits through these air signs that are coming up. I mean, and whenever we've got big things that are happening in a particular sign, things become promoted at that time in human existence. And the air signs tend to promote things like reason and intellect and rational philosophy and language and communication. The liberal arts generally, and education, technology, transportation, science, the empiricism as a mercurial concept, the fact that things can be measured, that we have that way of kind of thinking. You know, those are the energies that get really promoted during the movement of the air signs. Okay, and it all, you know, sounds. If there's any air signs in the room, we're all probably, you know, feeling very proud about ourselves right now. Yes, this is great. You know, it sounds very impressive. There's going to be a real emphasis on these signs coming up back to back. You know, we started in 1980, in 1981, with the successive conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter in Libra. And this was the forerunner of the multi-century run now that we will have of the conjunction of these 2 planets for the next, you know, 200 years will be in air signs. We had in 2000, and they conjoin, for those of you who aren't familiar with the cycle, Saturn and Jupiter join every 20 years. They define generational cycles. They've been moving since the 1800s through the earth signs, and we've seen the creation of the modern corporation. We've seen movements related to the earth, fossil fuels. I mean, there's a huge conversation, it's very clearly focused on earth. But where this conversation is now going, as of 1981, the thing started. In 2000, we had one last conjunction in the earth sign. So it was like a bit of going backward. And now in 2000, in December of 2000, we had the next conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, which happened in Aquarius, 0 degrees of Aquarius. And that ushered in the Biden administration, specifically in the US, but it also ushered in a series of protests and a number of really important movements that went throughout the world. We've been living the past few years, so I don't think I need to dwell on this any longer. Pluto's about to go through Aquarius. This is a big deal because Pluto's last movement through Aquarius coincided with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. It's a very prickly thing, particularly for the US, because of our sensitive placements in Aquarius. The US has its moon in Aquarius. But also this tends to be a very intense period in human history. And then we have Uranus moving through Gemini in the back half of this decade into the 2030s. And every time that Uranus has gone through Gemini, the US has gone to war, but, there's also been, massive changes in development and technology that happens as well. So we've got a big movement that's coming with this. We know that certain ideas are going to get promoted. Normally, we've got a situation where we might have this event happen in an earth sign and this one in a water sign and this in a fire sign. So there's a bit more balance. We're moving into a place where there's not a ton of balance. There's just a lot of the emphasis of this idea. There's a lot of possibility for us to use that productively. I'm a bit more conservative in my estimation about where we're headed in the short term. And so I'm likely to think, that what we're bound to experience is a referencing of the ideas through the air signs in a way that begins to move into the field of dogmatics, where we were having very strong forced language, forced outcomes in the name of, pick it. There's just such a sharp polarization happening right now in the West anyway. So, these themes talking about humanity, it's very important. I think when we think about the human signs, we think about transportation, philosophy, intellect, how smart we are, but we forget to remember that the human signs are also very much about the human experience. And what is it like to be human during these times? What does it mean to be human? That's a part of the question that we too often leave out. I found this quote from Henry Bergson, which was written in 1935. And he's talking about the delta that exists between the human experience and humans' capacity, where humans tend to place their energy, time, and place their values versus what we are capable of. And in his day, there was a real insistence coming out of, we're moving out of the Industrial Revolution. We're also just before that, we're coming from a place of inheriting the Enlightenment in the West and the movement of, rationalism. So there is around this time just this expectation that, morality can come to us almost like a machine. That, for much of human history, when science wanted to fix a problem, it was fixing a very real human problem. It was solving famine. It was solving, irrigation problems. It's solving very serious illnesses that are easily preventable. I mean, these are great places for science to go. Right now, we're very close to a period where science tourism is going to be available to some of us. So there is, now this question of whether or not our scientific advancements lining up with what's actually needed. So Henry Bergson was dealing with the same question in his time, where he's realizing that difference, that delta, the inherent delta between what we're capable of and what we choose to go after was getting wider and wider to Henry Bergson's mind. And what he says about this is that, to its credit, the truth is that science is given exactly what was asked of it, meaning it did what we told it to do. Whatever we put our minds to and whatever we use science for, it did it. And it has not, in this case, taken the initiative. It is the spirit of invention, which has not always operated in the best interests of humanity. It has created a mass of new needs. It has not taken the trouble to ensure for the majority, for all, if that were possible, the satisfaction of old needs. Millions of men never get enough to eat. There are some who starve to death. Mankind lies groaning, half crushed beneath the weight of its own progress. Men do not sufficiently realize that their future is in their own hands. Theirs is the task of determining, first, whether they want to go on living. And of course, it was exactly 10 years after Bergson published this statement that atomic bombs would then descend upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing an estimated 200,000 Japanese civilians. So, this question of whether or not the assumption that science is a way or a measure to lead towards good outcomes for humanity is one that Henry Bergson wanted to tackle full on. And in a way, he sets the tone for the entire theme that we're going to be talking about today, which is we guide. We have a very active role. We guide where our futures. We guide the conversation in ways that we may not be able to even see. The idea that science can turn back the right answer to us forgets the fact that we are the ones that are informing what science chooses to create as an objective. So Henry Bergson wrote about this in his book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion. And he's creating this contrast between a static culture and a dynamic culture. Here's a quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica that captured it, I think, really beautifully. In this text, Bergson claimed that the polar opposition of the static and dynamic provides basic insight. Thus, in the moral, social, and religious life of men he saw, on the one side, the work of the closed society, expressed in conformity to codified laws and customs, and on the other side, the open society, best represented by the dynamic aspiration of heroes and mystical saints, reaching out beyond and even breaking the strictures of the groups in which they live. There are thus two modalities, or rather two sources, the one having its root in intelligence, which leads also to science and its static mechanistic ideal. The other is based on intuition and finding its expression not only in the free creativity of art and philosophy, but also in the mystical experience of the saints. So what he's essentially suggesting here is that we need to learn that there is a difference between intelligence and wisdom. And intelligence leads to very static models that inherently do not grow. Intelligence is not concerned with growth. It is concerned with accumulation, and those are not the same things. You've got the wisdom side, however, which is very much concerned with growth. And there's I think an important distinction to be made here. So the question, as we're moving through this extended journey through the human signs, the questions that I think we probably want to start asking ourselves in a more serious and maybe less oblique way are, what are the limits of science? What is the role of mysticism in understanding the human experience? Is astrology inherently mystic? And can we take moral cues from science, or from astrology for that matter? Which I think as astrologers is the question that most interests us. But what are the limits of science? I mean, where can we reliably trust the information that we're given from science? And where do we have to recognize that science is now up against a territory that it no longer has tools to investigate? Okay, the role of mysticism in understanding the human experience. I'm going to be making the point that in this presentation that boundary where science can't touch, and that space that's outside that seems to encompass just about everything else, that is the realm of mysticism. Okay, so what is the role in understanding the relationship we have with that space in terms of being human? Is astrology an example of mysticism? That's a prickly one. I have a position on that, and I'll be providing that today. And my next question is, can we take moral cues from science or astrology for that matter? Can we take moral cues? What needs to be expanded from that, if anything? And is astrology capable of providing, moral information? I think to jump into this conversation, let's take a look at some recent history. I think the era where 19th century, 20th century, we're coming into the Industrial Revolution, we're nearing the back half, or maybe, depends on how you time it, the Age of Enlightenment, we're definitely into it now. And there's a remarkable thing that happens in the West, in the realms of, mystic experience and scientific experience. And they did not happen at the same time, but they were, largely kind of moving in similar streams. So what happens in the 19th and 20th century is that there is a sweeping westward of Eastern mysticism and transcendentalism. And so in this period, you get books like Walden, or Life in the Woods by Henry Thoreau. Or you get publications like this, Vedanta in the West. Now, Vedanta is one of the 6 schools of Hindu philosophy. It's one of the most impactful. I'm not an expert in Hindu philosophy. I am stealing what I know about it from Wikipedia. So, but this isn't really about that. The point is that we are sweeping from the East into the West a very different worldview than had existed in mythic literature at that time. And around the same time, we get the discovery of modern physics. And, there are these individuals that I've just shown, they are a select group of people. I told you we were in that book club, and the book we were reading was a collection of essays. My favorites were by these authors. And so I am highlighting segments from them throughout our talk. And that's why these are the 5 individuals you see. In the left, it's the familiar face of Albert Einstein. To his right is mathematician Arthur Eddington, philosopher. These were all mathematicians, philosophers, and they were all mystics as well, which is the important part that we'll be exploring today. Arthur Eddington, Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger. So he's the one that you might recognize him from the Cats. And then there's James Jeans over to the right. So modern physics, we start to have, with the rise of modern physics, an understanding about the subatomic world. We're getting pictures of the ways that the matter in the natural world interacts with itself that we didn't really have any models to explain. They baffled us, some of the discoveries that we were finding. But it was endlessly creating endless curiosities for us. We'll get to an example of one in just a moment. So if you're not familiar with some of the discoveries that were made by modern physics, we'll review that in a moment. But they had this incredible feel to them, where you would hear about the way that the subatomic world works, and it sounded remarkably like how the New Age movement was talking about the world of spirit, and how we were starting to read different texts that would be holding some images, almost like parallel reflections of this idea. And so there was a very instant, with this movement that I was already collecting in the West, this modern physics now comes that seems to be validating everything that you think that you're saying. And so, what was happening with the spiritualist movements was this tacking on and saying, see, modern physics, what these individuals are finding, these universities, these labs are finding, they're validating everything that we have said from the beginning. And then the modern physicists, these big names, the philosophers who were behind this, it was, a daunting and frustrating task for them to take up the mantle of responding to these claims that what they had discovered lines up with what these mystics realms are saying. And what these physicists essentially ended up saying was that you're wrong, but you're right that there is a layer somewhere here, but we are not the ones to prove it. So you're connecting dots where they don't exist. We just happen to agree with you. So it's, an interesting proposition. This also hits this discussion also hits the astrological community. I think that this is, in the 19th century where we start to see the beginning, the sowing of the seeds for maybe what we might call now vibrational astrology. I mean, this quote that I've just pulled up is from a 19th century text from Hiram Butler. It's called Solar Biology. And I think for those of us who have been in the astrological world for a little while, that title already tells you everything. There was a period, and it still does, occasionally come up, where there are very strong interests in connecting astrological themes to science and scientific information. And so you get things like solar biology in this way. This quote, to give you an example of like how this showed up in the astrological world: if the sun, moon, and planets exert an influence on the earth as a whole, then they must necessarily affect each thing in particular, and the relation to man, and the nature he derives by virtue of their positions is what solar biology undertakes to demonstrate. Conceding that they exert an influence in a general way, it is not presumptuous to attempt to draw the line and say the relation to the nature and character of man cannot be traced. Oh, that was supposed to be a question. I read it as a statement, but it means the same. We might as fittingly say that it is enough to know that the sun gives light and heat, but it is found that the ray of light can be analyzed, can be separated into its different colors, its various vibrations ascertained, chemical action determined, and many other wonderful and useful things demonstrated. Solar biology, so to speak, turns the spectrum of planetary influence upon the phenomena of human life and analyzes its significance. It's the exact same thing that's happening. We're taking the physical world and we're making the mirror that we see in the physical world too literal. We're making it quite literal here when we're saying that this ability to take the sun and take this the fact that we can trace the light and we can establish the line, we can see the pattern, that it should be quite literally the same thing that we experience in astrology. So, but this is the connection that was being made at this time. It wasn't just being made in the astrological world, it was being made in the world of New Age movements, but it wasn't only being made then. I mean, it's still being made today. So I don't know if any of you are familiar, and if you are, just shout yourself out in the chat box. This movie, it was a kind of a documentary. I don't know. It was part movie, part documentary. It's called What the Bleep Do We Know? And it was, you can see, discover the film that opens your eyes to new possibilities. It's time to get wise. I love this movie. I got introduced to it in high school by one of my best friend's dads. And, we would just talk about the concepts that were in here all the time. Loved it, loved it, loved it. And somebody's saying that they got the full DVD set. I think I did the same thing. I was just so excited by the ideas that were presented. Now, there was an interesting cast of characters in this. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the documentary first. I mean, basically what it is it is the connection that I've just been trying to say about New Age movement, taking vignettes of stories that we get from the world of physics, vignettes of this, and then creating a spiritualism around that concept. It's like a very close kind of tie that's happening between these things. And then there were a series of experts that would be brought on, and some of them would be from the esoteric circles, but then you would also have occasional people who were maybe more aligned with traditional academia. So the main character, at least for me, I just found her utterly fascinating. Jay-Z Knight, who is a channeler, and the entity that she claims to channel, his name is Ramtha, or the Ram. According to Jay-Z Knight, Ramtha, he was a Lemurian warrior who fought the Atlanteans some 35,000 years ago. He led a massive army, almost 3 million people. He was, in rulership for over 63 years, almost conquered the entire world. I mean, this was a very active individual who had then retreated and entered into a state of enlightenment and meditation. And this is the entity that Jay-Z Knight now channels. So, make of that what you will. We also had somebody by the name of Michael Ledwith, who was a professor of theology. Now, at the time that he was asked to participate in filming this, he had been removed in his post and excommunicated for the church as a result of sexual abuse allegations. He was Catholic priest. Then there's Fred Alan Wolf, who was a physicist, and we had a couple other physicists on the show, and people who would, study, like people who consciousness studies, anesthesiologists, PhD holders in history. There was a whole group of experts that were weighing in. Fred Alan Wolf was a physicist, and he had this sidekick character who was called Dr. Quantum. And so there's this video that you watch when you're in here, and this is the demonstration of the double slit experiment. And so I'm going to tell you, exactly how this happens, that an idea that is being observed in the natural world is then taken to validate an existing belief from a mystic perspective. So the double slit experiment, I'm just going to give you the high level overview because I actually did find the video itself, the Dr. Quantum video about the double slit experiment. It's on YouTube. So I'm going to link the YouTube video. I'm going to put this video, this recording on YouTube, and then in the description, I will put the link to that video if you want to see how it was explained and what the bleep do we know. But I'm going to give you my version. It'll be a shorter version. When we observe particles, okay, electrons, and shoot them through a single slit, okay, what we get is a single strip in the back, okay, where we can actually see they've moved through. We can see a single strip. That's what you would expect anyway. What we actually find happens is when we have this split, these two slits next to each other, where there's now a choice for when this electron comes out, there's two different places it can go, okay? So you would expect maybe there'd be two bands on the back. What we actually find is that they behave more like waves, and the point of interference of the two waves, where those intersect with the wall, we get these strips, okay? So we see that these two, this one actually, even one electron that gets shot registers in all of these places as having hit all of them at the exact same time. Okay, and it doesn't matter how many of these that you shoot, that pattern will form. You shoot enough to get that, you know, clearly being shown on measurements or instruments that can read this, you will show that they are hitting all the places that they possibly can. Now, what this suggests is that this singular electron is in all places at once. The very interesting thing about this is that the second that we observe, because when you see this pattern on the back, then you start wondering, well, what is going on here? Because let's see if we can observe which slit it actually went through and figure out what's going on. The second that we started to observe, we put a camera to it. We have a very particular way of observing and seeing that this is what's happening. We don't get this wave pattern on the back anymore. The electron, it only passes through one slit and leaves one mark on the back. That's it. So this is very strange that what we realize is the second something becomes observed, it's like all the potentials collapse and one actuation happens. But when things are not observed, everything's in superposition and technically could go anywhere. So this is, you know, a pretty big idea, obviously, and it's very tempting, you know, to see how strong that this connects with the idea that all things are connected, and, you know, there's a world of potential, and we're, you know, creating and driving this future forward. That was the connection that was being made here, was that the behavioral pattern of electrons proved that this is the nature of reality. Okay, but the physicists disagreed with this, and they said that we should be grateful that that's the case, because we do not, having not studied this, understand how limiting that would say, that how limiting reality would actually be if this was a reflection of what is going on in reality in the way that it has been painted. From Arthur Eddington, we get this quote, that we have learned that the exploration of the external world by the methods of physical science leads not to a concrete reality, but to a shadow world of symbols beneath which those methods are unadapted for penetrating. Okay, so here's, you know, it's a big thing that he said here. Physical science can't connect us to reality. What does he mean by that? It only shows us a shadow world of symbols. What does he mean by that? Beneath which those methods are unadapted for penetrating. What does he mean by that? What are we penetrating through? What are we talking about? To answer that, and we will answer it in this discussion, we have to ask first, what is science? And to ask what is science, we need to be a little bit careful with our language and terminology. So we need to split things into two here. We need to make a distinction between scientific method versus scientific domain, because with both of these, the word science is used in two different ways. And they don't mean the same thing, but to us, they look like they could mean the same thing. Scientific method is not something that you can only apply to science. You can apply the scientific method to the humanities. You can apply it to literature. You could apply it to, religious investigation, because what the scientific method is, it is a way of relating to information. It's not specific to where that information comes from. And the scientific method is a way of formulating a perspective and testing it. Now, how you do that in the spiritual part of your life is very different from how you do that about whether or not you burn your hand when you touch a hot stove. There's a very different way that, each level of experience will have a different way of exploring that, but the scientific method is not unique to science. And when we say it's not unique to science, so what's that science that I'm talking about? That's what we call the scientific domain. So I'm going to explain to you what the scientific domain is, or the concept of domains generally. And maybe we might avoid having to be so strict as to define where the scientific domain ends or begins, but I think we'll definitely know where it's not. Okay, so we're going to start with this core circle here. And I have to say that this is built off of a graphic from Ken Wilber in his book, Quantum Questions. So I just want to give credit to that. I've simplified it a little bit just for our purposes today. So we'll start with a small circle. And at the top, what we're going to measure, we're going to call this circle A. At the top, we have matter. Okay, so at the top, we're going to be talking about what is the thing that's investigated in this realm of experience. And at the bottom, what is the name of the science which investigates it? Okay, so matter, in the world of matter, it's physics. It's the core here. If we move out, and we move out of this cold existence of matter to the accumulation of a great deal of matter, we now have a realm about life, biological life. Okay, so you can see that A plus B is life in the study of biology. Okay, so it combines it takes physics in, it takes matter in to some extent. Matter and physics will inform biology, but it doesn't work the other way around. Biology does not inform physics, because biology is concerned about something completely different. It's answering completely different questions. In the same way that we might scope out a bit and say that there's also a study of the mind. Now, there is a correlation, of course, between biology and psychology, right? But this is where that connection kind of extends, is that the study of organic life does not necessarily include the study of philosophy and the mind, why ideas are more interesting to some and less interesting to others. This is not biology. And to the extent it is great, then it's explained. But there are bits that aren't and can't be. This is the realm of psychology. And then when we zoom past that, now we start to organize these principles around an idea of soulfulness. Now we're beginning to enter into something that is unique to the animal kingdom. Sorry, I would say animal kingdom, but even be more specific to say that, when we get to the whole animal kingdom, this ability to connect into ways of thinking. Because when you talk about soul, we're talking about not just the mind, but it's the combination of mind, body, and this like little extra, The word soul is a bit loaded, so I don't know if I want to go too far down that road, but I think you get it. And this is the route where once the ideas become organized, we then study it through the science of theology. Okay, the way of knowing called theology. And then beyond this, is the layer that contains everything. This is the final layer, whatever it is. It's the realm of spirit. It's the thing that it transcends all things. When we say that spirit isn't everything, what we mean is it can't help but not be. It must move and pulse through all things, and it does what it can through things. Spirit moving through me, a collective idea of spirit, this universal idea of spirit moving through me is very different. What it can accomplish is very different than if it moved through my mouse, which it does. It moves through all things. In my mouse, it becomes hard and still, it becomes like the nature of the thing that it is in. And through me, it animates, me and my body and my ability to work. So notice that in each level here, we've got, what this chain is showing is this transcending cycle, okay? This transcending cycle where we've got new layers that transcend but include the predecessor. We've got principles of higher and lower, okay? And exclusions and inclusions. So mind contains matter, but we can't say that matter contains mind in the same way, or can explain all of what mind is. But of course, mind is in matter. So that, you know, it's a one-way thing. Matter can't stretch beyond, but mind can push in. Do you get the difference between that? It's something about the spheres of influence that we're talking about here. Now, I want to take a quick break from this just to tell you that as astrologers, you should be familiar with this concept anyway, even if it's not immediately clear to you. In the West, in the philosophical world, this is how ideas have been organized, you know, for millennia. It's called the Great Chain of Being. You can see depictions of this from medieval Europe. I chose them because they were high resolution, not because I think that they're, you know, perfect examples of this. I mean, for one thing, they're both Christian in origin, which was, of course, going to be a common thing that you would find in medieval Europe, but there will have been, you know, other demonstrations. Okay, but you can see, for instance, that we start from the Earth in this very base place. And then and this is, you know, where the devil is down here, and then you've got the actual Earth down here below. You can see that we're moving up here. This is the moving up this chain. There's a literal chain in the middle. The trees are here. The animals are on the next level. The fish on another level. The birds on another. And then it's humanity. And then it's the angels. You know, it's the archangels. And then it's God. Right? And then if you move on the other side, you see the exact same thing, but it's more of a philosophical depiction. So you can see from the bottom, we have stone, and then we have fire, the plant kingdom, animal kingdom, humankind. I don't know if that's actually what that says is fire, but still, heavens, the angels, God. It's called the ladder to heaven is what's being used here. But this is the same scheme that informs Western astrology. It's the exact same scheme. I mean, this is how we typically depict it. We start with the Earth at the center and all of the elements, and we cascade them out. We start with the Earth at the middle, and then water, air, and then fire. Okay, that's the ordering. And then we move through all the different mineral to vegetable to animal kingdoms, and then we move into this place where we're talking about the spheres of the planets. Earth is at the center. From our perception, it is. You know, we don't see anything different than that. Earth's at the center, and then the closest body to us is the moon. And then we're organizing this in terms of speed. Mercury comes next, and then Venus, and then the sun and Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all the way out till we get to the fixed stars, which you can see depicted here, Calum Stellarum. Okay, and beyond that was the zodiac. So if you haven't heard this before, it's a good visual to demonstrate that the zodiac was never conceptualized in the tropical systems as, well, I mean, it was very, very, very anciently, but the distinction was made very early on, at least very early in our records, thousands of years ago, that the constellations after which the zodiac signs are named, they're not the same thing. The zodiac signs are computational points about where the sun is. They're seasonal. The very first day of spring is the very first degree of Aries. It's how that works. So at any rate, the constellations and zodiac, the actual stars themselves and the signs themselves, they're not the same. They're, you know, the zodiac was seen to be behind, and then beyond that would be the realm of divinity. Okay. And we have, even in astrology, a very clear understanding that there is an exclusion and inclusion happening at the same time. So this comes from Al-Biruni in the 11th century. And he says the planet whose orbit is lower, okay, and this would be the lower planets, is said to apply itself to that whose orbit is higher, because the lower planet is swifter. So we know this. We know the moon moves 12 degrees a day. Mercury can go up to 2 and some change. Venus can go fairly fast, over a degree. You know, we know that it gets slower the further out we go. So what he's saying is that on the inside, things move much faster. And as a result, when they're forming relationships, it's always the moon who applies to Mercury because she's faster. And it's always Mercury who applies to Venus. We don't say Venus applies to Mercury, right? Because she's slower. So this is what he says. The moon applies itself to all the planets and is applied to by none. This is why she's considered more inferior, because to get anything done, she has to go do it. That's why Mercury is considered inferior, because he has to apply to these bigger planets. The moon applies itself to all the planets and is applied to by none. Mercury applies itself to all planets except the moon. Venus to all except Mercury and the moon. The sun, Mars, and Jupiter to those above them. Saturn alone applies itself to no planet because all are below it. So the picture that's being illustrated for us here is a very clear image that the closer in proximity, there is going to be an effect on the way that the relationship can be mapped. And it's important to save that bit of information because it's useful for us in being able to understand the dynamic, in astrology is anyway, to understand who's the applying planet versus who's the separating planet. That gives us a ton of information. Similarly, when we're working with everything that's possible for us to learn in this universe, you know, this is the diagram that I think really, in its very simple form, kind of captures the cascade of human knowledge. And hopefully helps explain that, you know, that this pattern, it is so deeply ingrained in our psyche that if you actually look for it, you will see this principle and this idea anywhere that humans organize themselves. If you look for it, I was doing some research on this idea about the way that astrology conceptualize power and power dynamics in astrology. We know that we're inheriting astrology from, you know, Western conquests, conquerors and colonizers. I mean, we understand the inherent violence that comes through that. And some of the ideas that get put forward, you know, there's room for there to be some improvement on the implications that can come out of that. So one of the questions that I had was, you know, this idea that there is this hierarchy, and it is very much top down. You know, is this, I notice this is the way that, you know, humans tend to organize ourselves. If you take a look at the poster for capitalism, it was in the like 1910s or something, and it was the exact same poster. In fact, it was a reproduction from an earlier version that was criticizing the Russian Empire, but it builds this pyramid, you know, it builds that kind of thing where humans organize themselves in this way too. So I was just thinking, you know, if that triangle is a problem, is this way of thinking a problem? And one of the things that I found myself kind of engrossed into was a collection of sociological studies from people who were asking the same question. And what they determined, because again, you know, it can be hard to answer questions of morality from this level only. You kind of need to pull like out to this level to really be able to have a good tether. So it can be a little bit tough. And so, you know, these sociologists and psychologists were saying, well, here's what we can tell you for sure. All humans instinctually, all the humans that they studied in their tests, instinctually behaved according to these patterns. They recognized them, and there was also something about the way that they organized their life around those kind of concepts as well. And so that it would be a very deep thing to need to unroot, if anything, you know. So it was an interesting study, or a collection of studies. So at any rate, pulling out of that, you know, tangent for just a moment, I just want to return to this reminder that when we talk about physics, we're not really in a place to be able to give commentary about mysticism. Physics cannot possibly say what mysticism has to say. It can't. It's incapable of even being able to express what biology has to say. Physics is incapable of expressing what psychology has to say. You cannot use physics alone to explain any of this. So it doesn't actually really, you know, have the kind of ties that have been found. Because the problem with physics is that there's a limit to the questions that it knows how to ask. So it can't give you more information on what it observes beyond describing it. Here's a quote from Sir James Jeans, who was a mathematician, wrote Physics and Philosophy in 1948. He says, "We can never understand what events are, but we must limit ourselves to describing the patterns of events in mathematical terms. No other aim is possible. Physicists who are trying to understand nature may work in many different fields and by many different methods. One may dig, one may sow, one may reap. But the final harvest from any of these physicists will always be a sheath of mathematical formula, and these can never describe nature itself. Our studies can never put us into contact with reality. So in terms of demonstrating what's meant by this, I want to show you an example of, how everything's getting boiled down to a math problem, and how does that not get us closer, and what does he actually mean by this? So we're going to pull out, E equals MC squared. When I delivered talk the first time, I made a Mariah Carey joke here. At any rate, I'm not going to make that now, but E equals MC squared, obviously probably one of the most well-known mathematical formulas. What is it? I'm going to give you a really bastardized version. I'm not a physicist. Somebody may easily take issue with how I, characterize this, but I think that they will agree with the conclusion, even if I get some specifics wrong. And Marvin, you're an astrophysicist and you're in the room, so feel free to say something that you'd like. Energy, okay, so the E part, what is the E? Well, it's the energy that makes up matter in any body. And that is going to be equal to the mass of that body times the speed of light squared, okay? So what's being done here is we are creating a formula through which information can travel. Energy, which makes up the matter in any body, clearly that's a variable. We don't know what that is. The mass of that body, also a variable. That could be this phone, it could be this mouse, it could be me, and the mass in any of these will be different. So clearly the M is a placeholder. It is a variable for information to pass through. Okay, C, that's the speed of light. That is a constant. All right, so we know that. What's being built here now is an equation which shows the relationship between these three things. It maps the relationship between these three things. It does not care what is passed through, whether it's a phone or a mouse or a pen. Whatever's coming through will still have these same relationships as true descriptors. Okay, so math then becomes a language, that helps us see the way that these relationships are formed and the way that they appear in the natural world. Okay, so this is a point that's a little bit that blew my mind a bit, and this is again where I have to thank Marvin Jones for his support in getting my head wrapped around it. That math is built on axioms or statements that are assumed to be true, but they're ultimately unprovable. As an example of what we mean by these unprovable ideas, counting is one. This is an example of an axiom that we believe we can do. We act as if we can, and so far it's worked out. But there's no way to prove that counting, is always going to work for us. Probability theory, algebraic geometry, transitive property. These things we assume to be true because they appear to be true to our senses. They seem obvious. They seem like they should work. The transitive property is a great example. If A equals X and X equals B, then A must also equal B, because these things are all now saying that they are both the same. Okay, we don't have a way of proving this. Let me walk you through what we mean by that. Okay. When I took philosophy in college, I took philosophy of logic, and it's really it's math essentially. It's taking philosophy and putting it into an algebraic, formulaic kind of approach. I loved philosophy of logic, and I thought it was a really fantastic course. So if you ever see it and are interested in taking it, you should definitely do it. But let's start with this. A, all limes are round. Okay, and we're going to say that that's true. And B, all limes are green. Just for the sake of this example, we're going to say all of those are true. So A plus B, all limes are round and green. Okay, well, we know that A plus B is true if we know that A is true and B is true. Because what's being said here is that if If A is true and B is true, then you can combine them together and the whole thing will continue to be true. But if one of them is false, then the whole thing becomes false. All limes are round. All limes are green. Well, that's not actually true. So it's not true to say all limes are round and green. Okay. So what math does very well is it provides for us the structure. It provides for us, or we are describing a structure. What we are able to do with math is map a relationship, that if A is true and B is true, then we can say A plus B. All right. What math can't do is tell you anything about the substance or essence of the thing being computed. It has nothing to say about these things. It doesn't even have a line of sight into it. It can't see it. It's not built in a way to describe this. It describes relationships. It becomes almost like a shell. It's like a script that circumscribes the true essence of whatever anything really is. This is why James Jean said that we'll never be able to get in touch with true reality. All we can do is describe it. And then all we can do is give a shadow world of symbols. Because math is a language which maps relationships that are held between things. It can't say anything about the reality of those things. So let's read this quote again. We can never understand what events are, but we must limit ourselves to describing the patterns of events in mathematical terms. No other aim is possible. Physicists who are trying to understand nature may work in many different fields and by many different methods. One may dig, one may sow, one may reap, but the final harvest will always be a sheaf of mathematical formula. These will never describe nature itself. Our studies can never put us into contact with reality. Now, I've been talking about this from a mathematical perspective. I trained when I went to university as a linguist. Never did anything with it, but my degree is technically in linguistics. And I instantly saw a language metaphor. So I'm going to throw this in here in case it helps make this point a little clearer. So let's say we've got two groups of people. We got these people on the left who are pink, and the people on the right who are gray. And let's say that these two people, two populations, these are big populations of people, have now come into contact with each other. Obviously, the hope is that there is a common language between them, or something close, something where, they've got this ability to, like a lingua franca would be good, but also, even if you're dealing with close languages between, like Spanish and Italian, you can kind of jumble your way through, and you don't really need to do anything about it. You're more or less clear with each other. Hopefully there's a common language. But if there's not, what will happen is that these communities will instead form an intermediary language. And we call these a pidgin. Now, when pigeons are around long enough that there are native speakers, people who are, this is usually a few generations on, where the pidgin is established. It's been around for a while. It's been around at least for a few decades. And then what happens is we've got pidgin speakers who then give birth to people who learn pidgin as a first language. At this stage, that generation is going to create what's called a creole. Okay. Now, when the creole comes together, pidgin and creole comes together, it's going to take a little bit from both sides. One side will provide structure, and that's called the lexifier. In human history, this tends to be the more dominant more dominant society. But we're just going to note that for a moment because it's possibly relevant, and then kind of pull back. But what happens here is that there's one population whose language is going to provide the base structure. Is it subject, verb, object? Or, what is the order of adjectives? How do we pluralize? What does it mean to show possessive? These kind of ideas. We take basic points of structure. And then the other side, or called the substrata, It could be many languages. It doesn't just have to be one. There can be many that are feeding into this. They are then providing the loan words, and they will take the lexifier structure and simplify it. They will simplify it to a place that feels comfortable and easy and not unnecessarily like cumbersome. Okay, so this is where with the Creole, you know, if you've got language, but the lexifier, for instance, maybe has, you know, a list of tenses or tones or conjugations or persons this big. The Creole itself, the substrata, if their list is only this big, they will bring that list down. Okay, so that there's a lowest common denominator thing that's happening. I am, you know, obviously very much giving a super high level overview of the creation of a Creole. And there are some points of what I said that are generally okay to say, but, you know, probably need a few qualifiers. But I'm just making a simple illustration at this stage that there's something providing the structure, and then there's something that's doing what it can with what it has to wrap around that structure, to map that structure. Okay, this is where we're providing loan words, we're simplifying the structure to a place we can understand. And in my mind, that's exactly what all of humanity is doing in the study of mathematics. It is the universe that is providing the structure, it is providing the reality to be studied, it is providing nature to be studied. And mathematics is the human attempt to develop a Creole with the universe. But even still, languages are just tunnels for information to pass through. Okay, this is a very mercurial kind of concept. You know, Mercury is that tunnel guy. He creates the ability for the transmission of information. But Mercury is not necessarily concerned with the content. It's just he's concerned with the conduit. The moon's the one that's concerned with the content. Astrological point. So at any rate, this is what we're doing with mathematics. And I would, you know, actually like to say that this is also what we are doing when we work with astrology. And that does have something that we, you know, to say to us, and hopefully that will become clear to you soon. You know, we talked about with mathematics that you can have this mapping of relationships. If A is true and B is true, then A plus B is also true. And that math has no visibility to the substance of what A actually is, or what B actually is, or what A and B are together. Math can't see that. But we could have easily, just as easily, have said, well, now we're not talking about math. Maybe we're talking about an eclipse. Or maybe we're talking about the ingress of a planet into a new sign, like we just had with Jupiter making its ingress into Aries. Or a contact between two planets, like having Venus in square to Saturn. All right, to be able to, you know, make this connection and recognize that, you know, astrology can only show us the relationships that are being developed between things. Math and astrology is different because astrology is kind of, because it's concerned with cycles, it's like lungs that expand and contract. But even still, you still could reduce astrology down to mathematics if you so desired. To some extent. I mean, you're going to be missing the quality of information. This is where astrology is a bit different. You know, Venus, for instance, and Saturn, they have effects. You know, they have virtues that are being pushed and signaled. Mathematics can't really demonstrate that. But at the end of the day, we have the same problem with astrology as we do with mathematics, as we do with biology, as we do with anything else. They can't actually give us anything more than a finger that points at the phenomena. They are not the phenomena itself. All they do is point to it. They describe it in some fashion. I need to take you out of the presentation for a moment to walk you through this quote and help maybe contextualize this idea about what this says about astrology, what it says about what we're doing when we work with astrology. On the death of any living creature, this is from Aziz Nasafi. So Aziz Nasafi is a 13th century Persian mystic. I come from a spiritual tradition that is very much informed by the Persian mystics and Persian Sufis. And so, I read this and I nod immediately and think, yes, I get what is being said here. I find it a very passionate image. And so I'd like to share it with you. On the death of any living creature, the spirit returns to the spiritual world, the body to the bodily world. In this, however, only the bodies are subject to change. The spiritual world is one spirit who stands like unto a light behind the bodily world, and who, when any single creature comes into being, shines through it as through a window. According to the kind and size of the window, less or more light enters the world. The light itself, however, remains unchanged. So you get this image here that what's actually happening when spirit moves through matter, it is animating matter. But it doesn't necessarily, the spirit itself is interacting with the physical and material world. These things are inherently kind of connected. It's like that image that we got with the great chain of being, where spirit moves through all things. This is the demonstration of that principle through a mystic, more poetic lens. If I were to go back for just a second to show it, spirit descending through all realms of human experience. This is an example of what is meant by that. And so we get this image also that the form that we take, or the form that anything takes, it carries meaning. It carries meaning with it. It carries a perspective. And so when spirit passes through it, it is acting upon that imperative. So we study birth charts, for instance. We've got somebody with Mars rising, that's going to show up in their physical demeanor, but they were also born at this time when that principle was coming into a state of power. And so we would say, for instance, that, spirit animating that body is going to be working very strongly through a Mars principle, particularly when connected to where that Mars was at that time. It's basically the idea. I have this interesting quote that Deb Holding grabbed it for me. We had talked about this at some stage, and she sent it my way. It comes from a text by an author named Grant, but I don't have the last name. But he makes this point that, here, I'll just read it for you. It may seem superficially irrational to credit an astrological effect from a star's location upon an imagined creature, but it has been the opinion of the world's greatest philosophers that animating matter, or soul, is defined by form, and that it enforces the creation of a suitable form to allow the expression of its essential quality. Then he goes on to give this example that, say you've got a cow, for instance, and if it were stretched so that it was as long as a serpent, and then you removed its legs and it had to slither and crawl to move, it would cease to become a cow. It would become something else entirely. Its instincts would change. Its relationship to its environment would change. Okay, so that example comes from the 13th century philosopher Petrus Orioli. I don't know if I'm saying that name correctly, but the point is that our form actually reflects our reality. Okay, it reflects some story. I can tell you just a personal story that might be of interest to you. That kind of talks about this idea about how form reflects meaning. I was early in my horary career studying physical descriptions and the ways in which a certain planet at a certain position might have an impact on the way that we appear. So how astrology conveys information about physical features. And at some stage I realized that I have Mars ruling the ascendant and Mars in Sagittarius. So I can just maybe quickly type this out. So I've got, this is what I want. Mars in Sagittarius, and I've got Jupiter in Aries, and that's going to be in the 2nd, and that's going to be in the 6th. Okay, so this is relevant. These two bits of information are relevant. So I have scars all the way across my upper back. I had very bad acne when I was a teen. And there was quite a bit of, it didn't look very good, and it was everywhere. It was like just never left. I ended up having to take Accutane for it. It was that bad. Now, Mars in Sagittarius, to me, is a very clear descriptor of acne on the shoulders at the very least. And the reason for that is that a planet, when it is the second from its own sign, so you know that Aries is the head, Taurus is the neck, Gemini the shoulders. Okay, or yeah, in that area. Any planet in its own sign can be the head. So Mars in Scorpio would be the head. Mars in Sagittarius, which is the next sign from Scorpio, would be this region, you know, the neck down to the shoulders. Same thing with Jupiter. Jupiter's in the 6th house. Jupiter is in Aries, which is Pisces. Jupiter in Pisces would be the head. Jupiter in Aries, the neck and the shoulders. So I had a double confirmation that this area of my body was going to be an issue for me. And they're both in fire signs, and Mars rules the ascendant, and Aries is on the cusp of the 6th, and Jupiter's in Aries in the 6th. And so it makes a lot of clear that acne was the result of that configuration. But I had never taken my shirt off when I was in swimming pools or where I would go somewhere where I needed to take my shirt off. I just didn't feel good about it. I felt very embarrassed about it. And, but, you know, when I was in my, late 20s, I would have been right around my Saturn return when I was studying this, these techniques about physical form and astrology a little bit more seriously. I began to realize that I think on some level, rejecting my scars to such an extreme degree was a failure to understand that this says just as much about me in its own way as the fact that I am a Mars type person, a Mars in Sagittarius type person, that people might experience me this way. So it was like I'm divorcing the physical manifestation of the thing, of the form that, I have taken. So it didn't feel like a very coherent life to feel that kind of shame about anything connected to my body. And so I decided I am going to go take my shirt off on a beach somewhere. So I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I went to play beach volleyball with my boyfriend at the time and some of our friends. And it was a really cool afternoon. It was San Francisco in the summer, so it was foggy. And I wore a tank top, but it was a very, very thin tank. I was exposing a great deal of my back, so I felt, kind of proud of myself for that. Anyway, we played volleyball for a few hours, and then went home. And when we got home, like, my back tingled for a little bit, and I thought it was a very unusual feeling, but I didn't think anything of it. And then it happened again, and I knew I was about to get a sunburn. What I had not prepared myself for was how bad it was going to be. I mean, it was overcast. I really didn't think it was possible to get a sunburn in overcast weather. So I actually, when somebody asked if I wanted sunscreen, I said, no, I never tan. It might be good for me to get a little bit of sun. I never take my shirt off. Let me just one time not use sunscreen. I was such an idiot. Don't do that. I had a 2nd-degree burn from this wrist that went all the way up my arm, through my back, all the way through to the other arm, shoulder, to this wrist, with only 2 little straps where the tank tops were that were kind of unaffected. I had to sleep on my stomach for weeks. It was terrible. And it was very painful. But when it finally started to heal, I mean, it was incredible. My scars were gone for the most part. There are the really bad ones. You can still see evidence that they were there, but they were gone. And what was really the most fascinating thing to me about the story was that the scars were there, but the fact that self-acceptance would also be the way to heal them is also in my birth chart. The fact is, if you've got Jupiter in the 6th house, that is a healing through illness anyway. That there's a story there. Mars and Jupiter are in an applying trine with each other. There's mutual reception here. And so that Jupiter signature of acceptance and coming into relationship with yourself, and also reception itself, is an example of form and matter coming together. I have a whole different lecture on that, but the point was, this whole story was about this kind of self-acceptance moment. So it was really interesting, but it came on the back of me recognizing that this Mars in Sagittarius, it is part of my story. And, even the scars that come with it are part of the story that I'm, kind of here to tell. All right. So continuing on though, the point is that when we're working with this kind of understanding, what we recognize is that we're working with not something to say about the nature of the spirit itself. We're not talking about like anything in the mystic realm of things. With astrology, we're talking about the forms that have been presented to us. What's currently in a state of generation, what's currently in a state of decomposition. That's what you see through things that are applying and things that are separating. Okay, what is coming into form and what is falling away from form. Okay, so when we think about the impact for astrology, and this idea that what astrology is doing is it's showing the quality and relationship between things from that perspective. It has nothing to say about what's passing through it. It can't say anything about spirit. It doesn't have the ability to say anything about the mystic reality itself. But what it can, and that's, I can tell you that for this basic point, that astrology can't tell the difference between whether a moment is connected to a birth, a promotion, or a theft. It's agnostic, just like math is agnostic about what fills its variables. It is agnostic. But what astrology can do is it can describe how spirit is animating matter, where things are coming together and where things are starting to fall apart. This is what, in some extent, what we're doing when we're taking a look at a birth chart. This comes from Deborah Holding's research on Nicholas Culpeper. So this is a model. It's not necessarily like the model that you need to utilize, but it is one that I recommend. And this just gives you an example about how astrology was originally being used to give us reflections about the forms that we take. This is what natal astrology was about. So we say, for instance, that Mercury and the moon, they rule the animal spirit, which is seated in the brain. It's the part that makes us human. There's the vital spirit, which keeps us alive. And then the natural spirit, which moves life through our veins. But then there's this part that makes us rational, intellectual, emotive creatures who can sense things. This is a lunar connection. Okay. And we can see that the individual senses have their own signatures. Okay. They all have their own signatures and they each have their own combination of qualities. So, you might even be able to find, for instance, that obstructions to Saturn or an emphasis on malefics in cold and dry signs or malefic energy occurring in cold and dry signs, that may be an individual who has poor hearing or somebody with an issue with their hearing. It very often somehow accompanies people with Saturn on an angle that hearing or sight is in some way impaired, hearing by sympathy and sight by antipathy. But then there's the intellective side. So there's the imagination, which is about the forebrain. This is the, the ability to think about things and project things into the future. But then there's judgment, more of a midbrain activity, Jupiterian in nature, warm and moist, hot and dry. This is more of a choleric activity. You're moving faster than common sense can keep up with you. This is where the wisdom bit comes in, the warmth and moisture. Then there's the hindbrain that just stores everything. And of course, that's connected with things that are cold and dry, because things that are cold and dry, they preserve things. They bring things into themselves. Elephants are notorious, and we're recently on social media for its elephants and their ability to have deep and long memories. And think about, how Saturnian they look. They look like old creatures from the moment they're born, with all the wrinkles and the heavy hide. It's very Saturnian. It's connected with this whole theme. Okay. So when we're working with astrology, the mapping that we're dealing with is talking about what forms are coming together, which ones are disintegrating, which ones are most prescient in this individual's life, most influential. All right, now at this stage, we're about, I would say, probably 75% of the way through. I'd like to just very quickly, maybe 75%, worst case scenario, 2/3. I want to just quickly reiterate some points that you should be walking away with at this stage. The first is, if we're all, taking and occupying unique form, that a shared collective consciousness, whatever you want to call it, spirit, God, whatever, is working through, then we have to also acknowledge that no one can be you quite like you, and that there is a responsibility in some way for you to be you. We should also be taking from this that meaning is meant to be created. There is no meaning out there that we can objectively find with any tool that we have. We have to actively seek it out and create it as we go. That is how mathematics works. We start with what we can reach today. The next generation will reach a little further. The next generation will reach a little further. And our lives, we reach as far as we can in our early years to find meaning. And many stages in our life, this gets interrupted. We get a lot of mixed messaging about what meaning is. But if we really commit ourselves to it and take cues from people who have felt like they've really understood this and mastered it for themselves, the common theme is that meaning is something that is created with the environment around you. Okay. The third point is that astrology cannot say anything about the ultimate reality of anything. But like mathematics, it does necessitate a mystical domain, because otherwise, what is it describing? What is it describing? We don't know. It's something quite big, untouchable by us. This is where we get this imagery within the Sufi texts that divinity, godhood, spirit, you can have a personal relationship with it, but it's ultimately unknowable, because in that diagram, it would be like, in some way, we are like matter. Even if we extend it all the way out to theology, we still don't extend all the way out to the layer of spirit, but spirit does move and pull through us. So while you can have a personal relationship, can you say that you understand and know it fully? No, you cannot. This might be a bit contentious, but I would argue that the practice of astrology is not inherently a practice of mysticism. Mysticism, any more than practicing math, is automatically mysticism. Mysticism takes an awareness, and it takes a focus, and it takes an intention to be committed to that perspective. When we are 8 years old, we learn our times tables, addition, I don't know, is it 8 years old? But when we're kids, we learn our mathematics. And it's mostly just repeating what we were told. We haven't established a relationship with what mathematics actually is. What is it actually saying? Does it actually say anything? The brilliant minds in mathematics will tell you, if you ask them, actually, we don't know. Math is, we continue working with it. We're building on it. I'm going to quote Marvin Jones here and say that mathematics is faith in action. So you can use mathematics as a vehicle to a mystical experience, but it is not mystic inherently on its own. It needs something else. Same thing with astrology. It's a language, so it depends on what you pass through it. Finally, entering into a mystic experience and meditating on themes related to mysticism, meditating on themes related to astrology, related to what we know from our astrological education. It doesn't require that you step out of the mundane realities of your life. I would argue that to have a genuine experience, you need to be just where you are. You need to be able to have those experiences there. Let me tell you a little bit about how I kind of contextualize that for myself. Before I became an astrologer, I had a career working in data. I used to work with data in a kind of asset investment. Actually, I think you could probably say every job that I've held related to data was connected to the idea of asset investment. So there was a lot of very rigorous mathematics about best investment methodology, and also ways that we can bring data together to expand our line of sight and our vision. And one of the things that always felt clear to me was that when we work with data, it's not that different than when we read stories about people who would consult the oracle at Delphi. You come to the oracle with a question in your heart, You ask the question, and what you asked dictates what the response is. And with data, we ask the question multiple times. We ask the question, what is it that we think we want to know, which then informs what data do we think we need to collect that, which then informs how do we choose to collect it. Then we bring all that data together. Then we put it into some kind of machine using some form of data structure, and then we query it. So first what happens is we build the oracle at Delphi, and then we ask questions of it. Now, if you don't see the huge vulnerability to operating within a blind spot from that alone, then you might not have, I might not have made my point well enough. I can give you some examples of how this has come together, you know, in the data world. So this is an example presented here from the Scientific American. It says racial bias found in a major healthcare risk algorithm. So in 2019, researchers found that an algorithm used on more than 200 million people in US hospitals to predict which patients would likely need extra medical care heavily favored white patients over Black patients. And the reason that this happened, it wasn't because race was an explicit variable, but there was another variable used that did have a high correlation to race, and that was healthcare cost history. So the rationale was that healthcare costs summarize how many healthcare needs a particular person has, that there would be a one-for-one relationship there. And for a number of reasons related to the relationship, for instance, that Black Americans have with the US healthcare system, or access to healthcare, any number of reasons you pick it, patients incurred lower healthcare costs, Black patients did than white patients with the same conditions on average. And so, you know, already with the data we chose to pull out, we somehow didn't find the answer we thought we were going to find. Amazon had a very similar thing recently. It was, you know, Amazon's one of the largest tech giants in the world, probably, you know, is by now, besides Apple, I think. But Amazon ditched AI recruiting tool that favored men for technical jobs. In 2015, Amazon realized that their algorithm used for hiring employees was found to be biased against women. And the reason is because the algorithm was based on the number of resumes submitted over the past 10 years. And it was trying to use machine learning to extract from those resumes what qualities we're looking for. But what they found was that men and women did not qualify or quantify their achievements in the same way. And because most of the applicants they hired were men, and most of the applicants were men, the AI tool favored male applications going forward, because that's what informed its logic. Another example comes from software used to predict future criminal activity. And of course, it was biased against Black Americans. So the most notable example of AI bias, probably the COMPASS project, the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions is what COMPASS stands for. It's an algorithm that was used in the US court system that was meant to gauge what the likelihood was of somebody returning to criminal activity if they were released. And based on the data that was returned to them, they would make a determination about whether to grant parole. It was used in sentencing, it was used in quite a number of places. And what they found was that the model predicted twice as many false positives for a return to criminal activity for Black offenders, so 45% false positives, than white offenders. White offenders had 23% false positives. And, you know, just the impact of this is, you know, it is so massive. So this is, you know, these are some easy examples that didn't take a whole lot of work to find. But the reality is that data is used everywhere in our lives, and you can find it anywhere that you look. After I gave this presentation, I was speaking with my friend Michael Morris, and they were telling me about, you know, when you go on dating apps, for instance, you can mark that you're a trans person, but then you have to select the gender that the search result gender you want to show up under. So you might identify as trans, or, in some way want to remove yourself from that form of categorization, but you don't actually have that choice. You now need to choose whether you show up in searches for people who are looking for men or people who are looking for women. You don't have that kind of flexibility in the same way. So it's interesting, to, sit back and think about, because when I heard that example, it had not occurred to me. I did not think about that. So there are places all over where we would find very similar stories. Now, I'm a horary astrologer. This idea, the real problem with all of this is that the people who are building this did not reflect the communities who were going to be impacted by these technologies. And so as a result, you inherently had bias come through. What we had was the results between all three of these, what's going on with Amazon, what's going on with this algorithm about healthcare bias. What happened is we created the oracle, and then we stared back into it like it was a mirror. And then we expected that we would get an answer that didn't reflect the assumption we already had going in. All right, that's the issue that we've got. Now, I'm a horary astrologer. I deal with people coming to me with questions all the time. I work with divination on a regular principle. I mean, that's, to me, data has always felt like divination for this reason. It has that kind of very same, the exact same themes. I'm going to show you two examples now of times where I felt this same phenomena was happening and being shown through horary astrology. Now, this is a question that came from a querent who was 29 years old. She had a mole that was changing both in shape and size. She was already fearful of cancer, casting horary charts on a nearly weekly basis, fearful that a new discomfort in her body was ringing a proverbial death knell. Now, these charts that she would cast for herself, she's a very skilled astrologer. So she would, and a skilled horary astrologer. And so she would, when you take, she's a self-proclaimed hypochondriac. So you take hypochondriac and horary astrologer, and you get a recipe for potential disaster. So, every time there was just something going wrong, anything that would, cause her problems, she would then cast a chart to see, if this was spelling the end. And when she would do that, we would often find like the malefics were angular, the ascendant ruler would be combust, it'd be in the 6th house or the 8th, or there would be a hard aspect between the moon and one of the malefics, or the 6th or the 8th ruler, all the things that might have actually justified her fear in the first place, if that had been taken from an independent source. But she was casting her own horrors. And, what was really happening in these instances was she was seeing her own terror reflected back to her. Her doctor's suggestion that the mole be removed sent the querent into a panic. She wanted to know whether the mole was benign or malignant, and whether this was going to be the beginning or the end. The beginning of the end. She contacted me for a consultation. So you can see it was done on the 2nd of February, 2022, 11 a.m. She knew that too. So she showed up to the consultation having already looked at this chart. And I think she opened with something like, I already know. She's just immediately stressed and, completely all seized up. She says, I already know what you see. And this is what she, drew out for me. She said, you can see the moon making an application to the 8th ruler. See how Jupiter rules the 8th. You can see that my significator, Uranus, is right on the cusp. My significator, Venus, is cadent. The significator of illness is angular, and it's retrograde, and it's conjunct Pluto. You can see that Mars is applying to a conjunction with Venus, because remember, this is the time when Venus was moving very slow. She had stationed in this degree. She had just stationed in this degree, in fact, and Mars was going to be catching up. So she's looking at this thinking like, oh, and the sun is conjunct Saturn, end of life. Very strong themes. That isn't what I saw. What I saw was the moon conjunct a benefic in the 11th house. What I saw was Venus in a fortunate house in trine to the ascendant. I saw Uranus leaving the ascendant because it's more than 5 degrees. I saw Mercury retrograde, but actually preparing to station. Venus, what was I going to say with that last point? Well, I don't remember, but I was also going to say something like, oh, yes, that's it. Venus had just stationed direct, showing recovery. And Mars was going to aspect Jupiter, which is a benefic in the 11th, it's dignified, and then apply straight to Venus. And so he would essentially translate the light from a benefic planet in the house we associate with healing. So my judgment on this was, it's not a malignant tumor at all. It's going to be just fine. But what you're looking at is your own fear. You're unable to see all the positive in this because of the fear that you have. Even the facts that are in front of you, you don't see them correctly, or you don't see them objectively. Let me say it that way. You don't see them objectively. And she said this was one of those charts that really made a big difference to her. This was back in February. She's still alive. The mole got removed. It was benign. Her life is great right now. Everything's beautiful. Lisa has asked, is the 11th house relates with healing? And yes, it does. You could say the 9th, 1st, 10th, 11th could all be associated with healing, but the 11th in particular, because it is the house out of which, when you leave the 12th, you enter into the 11th. So you go from imprisonment to freedom, you go from illness and hospitalization to recovery. So that's the image, is moving from a bad place to a good place. But, not all these like mirrors that we create for ourselves are bad stories. I have one client who also is himself a skilled astrologer, who regularly runs, and I think maybe a little bit too frequently, runs horries to determine whether or not a particular investment strategy would be very profitable. So in this case, the querent wanted to know how strong his profits would be in the long term, 5 to 10 years out, if he purchased an investment property in his hometown of Dallas, Texas. He said this chart argued sky-high profits and that they were waiting for him, and he had no doubt of that. He just wanted to know whether or not I agreed. And this is what he saw. He saw the ascendant ruler. Oh, shoot. Sorry. He saw the ascendant ruler, Jupiter, dignified, receiving the application of the dignified benefic ruling the 10th. I mean, that is a classic picture of windfall of cash. It's a great signature, actually. It looks really good. But that's where he stopped. That's where he stopped interpreting this chart. That was enough for him. He saw the moon in the 4th house too. That's good because it's what he wants. The moon's applying to Saturn, which is the 2nd ruler. So property coming to him in his pockets. I didn't interpret it that way myself. To answer a question like this, whether or not the property investment would be good, generally for a client, I'm going to try to answer at least 3 things. The first is, how well positioned am I to enter the market? And I agree with him that he's well positioned to enter the market. He's dignified, by being in the sign of Pisces, Venus in Pisces in conjunction. That's a great picture. I think that looks really good. His financial picture looks good too. His 2nd ruler is Saturn in its own sign, which is fairly strong. So those look like good indications to me that he's in a decent place to enter the market if he wanted to. The second is, what is the current health of the market and how well would the average investor perform, do you think? Now that is where things get sticky because he didn't really look at that at all. And I want to walk you through what I see. What I see is the 8th ruler in the 4th. I see the moon, so the 8th is associated with loss and things that are in a state of decline. Okay, so the moon's in the 4th house, which relates to property and the property market. Okay, so the moon's in the 4th house. It's making an aspect to Saturn. So, the moon aspecting Saturn is it is the classic signature for things falling and taking a tumble and things moving lower. The 4th ruler, which property market, is Mars. Mars is cadent. Mars is in Pisces, which is all right, but it doesn't really do anything special for Mars. But Mars is kind of disconnected from a lot in this chart. And the moon is separating from, oh no, that's not right, sorry, my apologies. I was making the wrong connection there. There's no aspect between the moon and Mars. But there is an aspect between the sun and Mars. Now, this is interesting to me because I had looked to myself at the fifth house. The fifth house is the house of agents. So, real estate agents and people who make deals and work on your behalf. The fifth house has a trine between the ascendant and the seventh house. Sextile to the seventh, and it's the joy of Venus, and so it's a very diplomatic and respectful sign. So it seemed to me interesting that there was the sun in the fifth house, in this house related to agents, because the fifth house is also the second from the fourth, which could show any second house from another would show financial investment. Okay, or resources or money to be had, the wealth of a particular thing. So the fifth house represents agents on a standard, not turning the chart perspective. But when we turn the chart and see it from the fourth house's perspective, the fifth house represents people who are in the industry connected to real estate. So the sun represents big, magnificent things that are hard to avoid, things that are massive. And what was really interesting to me was that the sun was making an application to Mars. The sun is the only planet that's making an application to Mars. Now, the relevance of Mars is that Mars signifies property in this chart. Okay, so now we've got the sun making an application to Mars. And what I think that's pointing to, because the sun naturally signifies big ostentatious things, and because the sun in the fifth would be suggestive of big ostentatious things that work in real estate. I mean, the sun's in Taurus, which is also connected to material, physical things. Okay. My judgment from that was that we're talking about companies that manage big real estate portfolios, and they are the ones that have access to the property, and that they are the ones that are in a better position to make a good deal. My client actually is cadent. If you take a look at this, Venus and Jupiter are cadent in this chart. There's no energy here, but the sun's in exactly the right place. It's in a good house, making a good contact with a significator of property. But what's really prickly for me is the fact that the moon is coming to the end of her cycle. And if you remember, this was actually when the moon, sun, and Uranus came together, okay, in early May, or was it it was the tail end of April, like 30th of April. And there was an eclipse in Taurus. This is the same eclipse which predated the leak that happened on May 6th related to the potential for the Supreme Court to reverse Roe versus Wade in the US. It's that eclipse, moon, sun, Uranus. So when the moon comes to the end of her sign or the end of her phase, the image that we start looking at is something that's about to collapse, especially when Uranus is there. That gives a dramatic collapse. So this to me already looks like the market itself it's overpriced. It's connected to themes related to loss. Okay, the market itself is cadent, which is a good indication that there's not a whole lot of value to find out there. The pulse is really weak. There's nothing really great. And the people who have the best line of access are the people who are closer connected to the agents, people who are closer connected to the industry itself. Okay, so the health of the market looks like it's on very volatile ground and not too far away from a bubble burst. And then the question is, are there indications of a transaction? And this is the part that he skipped as well. No, there is not. Mercury, which rules the seventh house of the seller, and the ascendant would signify the buyer. Mercury is separating from Jupiter. You see that? Mercury is actually set. So these two are separating from each other. What this would tell me is that his best opportunity to have purchased property is actually behind him. He missed that opportunity. It was probably about 2 years ago because there's a 2-degree separation between Mercury and Jupiter. But what does happen is that Venus aspects, because Mercury is about to station retrograde, so it's going to freeze still in the early degrees of Gemini, which means that Venus is going to be able to conjunct Jupiter, which is the buyer, my client, and then make a sextile to Mercury across a sign boundary. Okay, so on the other side of the sign boundary, the connection comes together. So the judgment that I could make, because Venus rules the fifth, is if you want this property, an agent can be at if you work through an agent, you can make it happen. But I want to walk you through what's going to happen. Venus also rules the 10th house. The 10th house shows the profit. Okay. How good the deal is. Was it a good deal? Was it a profitable deal? Are we happy with what happened? How'd that feel? That's signified by Venus. And my client was so excited about the idea that Venus was exalted, conjunct Jupiter in its own sign. This all looks amazing. But we have to remember that there's no connection between Mercury and Jupiter, so we can't just use this conjunction on its own. We have to allow Venus to make the connection, which means that Venus has to move into Aries to sextile Mercury, who will be stationing, which is itself an image of reversals. Mercury is. And when Venus moves from exaltation in Pisces to detriment in Aries, ruling the 10th house of profit, what it suggests is the second that you make that deal, and you make that deal, you've already lost it all. Because the significator of profit has to lose all of its strength to bring the connection together. You'll have to pay too much. I sent this all over to him, and he said, well, you know, that sounds like it's going to be very complicated, and I don't want anything too complicated like that. I want it to be much easier. I want it to kind of fall in my lap. Now, how does that fit with Jupiter being applied to by Venus in the third house? That cadency shows there's no energy. And I did say that to him when I wrote my judgment. I said, this also looks like there's just no energy here. And he said, you know, you're right about that. I don't have the energy to get this going. I really thought that I would have a good transaction here. So what happened again is we've got this image that he's building a story in his mind, and he opens up the horary for himself, and that's all he can see is the reflection of his own desire. Now, I went into the news in Dallas, and I found confirmation of exactly what I thought I was going to find confirmation for. That big companies like Zillow and was it BlackRock and those big organizations, they took a huge stake in Dallas because it was a metropolitan area where the property was relatively affordable, and you know, you could still really grab into it. And they, you know, Zillow, for instance, it's got all the market data. It's been collecting market data for, you know, a decade plus on real estate transactions that are happening all across the US. And so it's best positioned to understand exactly what's going to happen in the market. You know, they've got data they can run on all of this. So they went in and bought a whole bunch of houses in North Texas, including Dallas, and ended up, you know, now inflating the market and having to sell more than 81% of the homes that it purchased for less than it paid. Huge loss for Zillow. But that's exactly what this chart showed, was that there was investment energy happening from a very big point of force. Now, when I work with data, and any of us work with divination, you know, there are times where we feel disheartened by what we find and disheartened by what we see. I want to give this quote to you from Stefan Moll, which I think is a really powerful quote that I heard about in a lecture given by Dr. Dorian Greenbaum in Australia at the FAA conference in 2020. She gave a talk on the origins of horary astrology, and she provided this quote, and it's haunted me ever since in the best way. Stefan Moll, who's a German Assyriologist, he says in Divination Culture and the Handling of the Future, we can see that the future as crystallized in the present was the result of a dialogue between man and God, an act of communication that could be initiated by gods or by men. Divination was not an expression of fatalism or listless resignation. Instead, it allowed shape or form to be given to an amorphous, in many situations, threatening future. This deprives the at first unfathomable future of some of its dread. After all, the perspective towards the future, as revealed by the omens, it marshals a human response, a directive that was needed, especially when the portents were bad. Omina concretized the future, which could then be furthered or prevented by specific actions. I heard this quote, and the first thing that I heard to myself was this recognition that even if the divination is wrong, the fact, have you ever had this situation where you're trying to explain to a friend how you feel about something, and they say, you mean like this? And they repeat it back to you, and you say, no, it's not that, but it's this, you know? because by getting it wrong, they've made it so much easier for you to get it right and to clear the space, because we have now given form to this thing that didn't really have a form, that didn't have a shape that we could hold on to, that we can grab onto. And once we give this form, we can understand it better. We can manipulate with it. We can work with it. We can give it shape and engage with that idea. And this is why he's saying it marshals a human response when what we hear tells us something that bothers us. Well, what are we going to do about it? It's not fatalistic to provide these kind of consultations for people in any form that they take. Divination instead is meant to inform us about what we see and where we are, and what paths might be open to us. Okay, so at this stage, I just want to remind that when we're talking about this passage through the air signs that we've got coming up over the next couple of decades, it's this part about what divination do we see happening out there in the world, that we see happening through data, happening through the movements of large masses of people, where, the omens look very bad. It marshals a response from us. It causes us to need to find a way to tap into what it means to be human, what it means to connect with each other, to connect with something bigger than ourselves, and to connect with something that does already unite each of us. So the practice of astrology alone, on its own, it isn't mysticism. Like mathematics, it gives us a structure to begin to have this conversation, but it is not the conversation itself. It's the finger pointing to the phenomena. It's not the phenomena itself. It's not the phenomena itself. And to understand something about, where we should be moving collectively, where the human experience is, where we'd like to see it go, it's this coherent connection with the human experience that we need to return to if we're ever going to answer that question fully, if we're even going to get close to being able to answer it. So in an era where science is becoming more and more, science and money are dictating exactly what things we pay attention to, and where we go, and what's available to us and what's not available to us. We have to remember to pull back from the temptation to allow those things to be a moral guide. Remember what Henry Bergson said in the beginning of this, that science will do exactly what we ask it to do, and it will go no further. So we have to learn how to ask bigger and better things of science, more impactful things, more meaningful things. And the determination about where you fire that arrow, it can only really come from within. It can only come from a meditation on what it means to be human. And that, I believe, is the role that mysticism has as we move through the next couple of cycles with these air signs. The final point is just a reminder that the mystic experience doesn't need you to change anything about your life. You should continue to be exactly where you are. You just need to be intent with it and get it started. I love the quote from my friend Mason. You saw his photo on the second slide. He used to say, you need to meditate for an hour every day. And if you don't have time, then you need to meditate for 2. But it is this idea of returning to a much more still, much less prescriptive, much more sensing, much more feeling, but not ignoring what's around us. It is about a coherent experience. I was listening to one song in particular that provided a lot of inspiration for this talk. So I'm going to quote famed poet and mystic Kendrick Lamar in his song Purple Hearts, which was recently released. If God be the source, then I am the plug talking. And I think that kind of captures the spirit of what I hope to convey today. So that is the conclusion of today's webinar. And I just want to say thank you so much for hanging in with me. I can't believe we did it in 2 hours. I was worried it was going to go a little bit over. I really appreciate so many of you being here and joining me today live. And then for those of you who are watching the recording, I also appreciate that, and the support of my work that you have given all this time. So appreciate that very much. And you all have a beautiful, beautiful week.